To make switching to the new Boost Mobile risk-free, we're offering a 30-day money-back guarantee.
So why wouldn't you switch from Verizon or T-Mobile?
Because you have nothing to lose. Boost Mobile is offering a 30-day money-back guarantee.
No, I asked why wouldn't you switch from Verizon or T-Mobile?
Oh.
Wouldn't.
Because you love wasting money as a way to punish yourself because your mother never showed you enough love as a child?
Whoa. Easy there.
Yeah.
Applies to online activations. Requires port in and auto pay. Customers activating in stores may be charged non-refundable activation fees.
If this Muad'Dib is a religious figure, you can't use direct force. Repression only makes a religion flourish. You'll only end up humiliating yourself.
You underestimate my sardaukar.
You underestimate the power of faith.
Hello, guys, and welcome to a new episode of Hollywood Gold. I'm your host, Daniela Taplin Lundberg, and I'm here with Vanessa Mendel, my right hand. How are you?
I'm great. How are you doing?
So good. We are about to jump into an episode technically on Dune 2 with Joe Walker, the editor, but really it's a talk about his many films because he's been a longtime collaborator of Denis Villeneuve and also Steve McQueen. And so it's really a deep dive into the brain of a brilliant person.
Yeah.
So I'm so excited.
He's such a prolific editor. It's kind of unbelievable the amount of incredible movies he's been a part of. I'm so excited to listen.
So let's get going.
Let's do it.
Joe, tell me a little bit about, I read a little bit about you and you started in the music department at York. And I want to understand just quickly, because I really want to talk about Dune, but your path from sound to visual, and obviously they're very tied, but just talk to me a little bit about like your early days and how you found yourself as one of the greatest editors working.
Oh, thank you.
I really believe
very
that.
Flattering.
Yeah.
God bless you.
I'm not going to lose your number, put it that way.
Yeah. I found myself like really torn between the two, even when I was a child. I mean, I was one of the kids that, you know, my parents had an 8mm camera and somebody given them for their wedding. And I used to think that was the most glorious thing, was them looking at these little 4-minute silent 8mm film shows against, you know, a white wall in the sitting room. And so I was kind of fascinated by that. And, you know, I had an uncle who was a priest and he used to do trick shots where he used to climb up a ladder praying and then disappear.
Stop.
And yeah, it was just, I was kind of obsessed by it. And I kind of then got into, but I was also studying music and I kind of really attracted to writing music and arranging music, and I was doing orchestral work.
Joe, do you still do that today or have you sort of left that behind?
I've kind of left it behind. I kind of feel I've transmuted it into something else. You know, I'm kind of still slightly at that point of not really being sure. I used to look at this film called Stepping on the Gas, which is an old Keystone Cops film. And I used to play it really slow and then play music really slow on my dad's, you know, kind of Wagner records and kind of get sort of depressed before you know what depression is, you know, when you're like 8 and it's a long summer, you know, that kind of feeling. So, no, that's what I did. And then I kind of studied music. I was in bands and then, you know, wrote a big orchestral piece as my graduation kind of piece at York. York was an incredible place to be. It was the least academic kind of training. It was very practical. There are a lot of great players and conductors and composers there, teaching as well as studying.
And so how did you parlay? I had sort of read that you found yourself sort of accidentally working for an assistant editor. Like, how did you parlay into like the visual medium of editing? Like, how did that kind of happen? Or was it just happenstance?
I kind of knew what an editor was because we had a family friend who was a successful Hollywood editor. He was a guy who'd started at Ealing Studios in London, and he'd always been ambitious to work on a big American film, and my mum had helped him do his paperwork, and he ended up cutting films like Death Wish and sort of little films over in Hollywood anyway. And he made the break and sort of he adopted the persona, I think, of a Jewish person, even though he wasn't. He used to wear a Star of David, and he was kind of a wonderful character. He was married, typical, married a psychoanalyst as his third wife, but then married a really lovely woman who's a makeup designer who I'm still in touch with. And, I think it was the third wife, was this wonderful lady who I'm still in touch with. Anyway, he was a kind of inspiration. It's one of those things where you kind of realize when you're quite young that somebody can make a living out of something. And his passion was very, very infectious. And I started to realize that the kind of skills I had kind of garnered doing composing, like cutting up 1/4-inch tape and being very aware of the oral, was going to help me get a job somewhere at the BBC initially. So I kind of, I didn't know anybody. I mean, my kids are always complaining to me that, it was easy for you then, but it really wasn't. It was kind of, I didn't know anybody in the industry at all. And it was just somebody whose mum ran the photocopying room that was next to the cutting room that was cutting something, would connect me possibly with somebody who worked there on Wednesdays. It was one of those kind of ways.
And did you feel like you kind of had like a sort of loose vision because of this mentor type figure of where you were headed? Or were you just kind of taking any opportunity and kind of grabbing it and taking it?
I had a real passion for the role that sound could play in a film. I have to say that was the thing that that was the itch I wanted to scratch big time. And I spent many years kind of working as a sound editor for the BBC. I mean, it's kind of quite an absorbing world. That I was trying to explain to somebody the other day that one of the first things I worked on was a very early Miramax film. I think it was their second film. And it was a medieval film with Colin Firth and Ian Holm, and it was very funny, and it was set in medieval France. And I do remember that it was the biggest thing I'd worked on at that time. And I remember that it opened with a kind of murder in a kind of French medieval, sort of narrow alleyways of medieval France. And the director had said, could you put some like barking dogs? There's a commotion and people are trying to find what's happened in this street. And that's the beginning of the film. And I wrote off to some sound effects company and asked them for this dog, and this perfect sound turned up. It was a dog called Rex. And Rex was like a really dumb dog. They just went, oh, oh, oh. But it had this sort of perfect alleyway reverb, and I put it in the film. And the guy who was mixing was this old school, faintly alcoholic, kind of quite rough-edged diamond who said to me, he said, didn't you like the film? And I said, no, I really liked the film. I love the film. I love the film. And he said, well, why did you put Rex in the film? I said, I have no idea what you're talking about. He said, Rex is an international code to all sound mixers and sound editors coming to see this film that it sucks. And that they should go and and that it should go and do something better. He says, if you put it in the opening reel and you're telling everybody, it's going to get worse.
No, you're kidding.
There was even a film made in Britain that was set in space that had Rex in the opening shot. There was a shot of a spaceship. And if you listen carefully, there's a oh, 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 oh. So I kind of loved that world, but it had been around a long time before me,
So you came at editing really from the audio perspective, that was like as important as anything, which I could not agree with you more. Talk to me about the process and use DUNE as sort of the case study, but we can talk about all your films because you and Denis obviously have a marriage and it has evolved over time. And what I would say is like the hallmark I see, because I've done an episode on Arrival, is this sort of grounded science fiction, right? Where you feel very much connected to all of these characters, but it's a world that doesn't exist in the real world. And so just talk to me about starting the Dune process and creating it with Denis, obviously, and just start, and I'll pepper you with questions if you can. I know it's a big, tall order, but that's what we're here for.
Well, no, thank you. I mean, look, the truth is it's, kind of the sound, the thing that's a kind of upgrade to me about moving, if you like, from composing music, which I did professionally for years, after being a sound editor, then a picture editor, then a composer.
Wow.
The big upgrade was being able to kind of work with performance. And I'd worked in drama cutting rooms, so it was it's like such a bonus to work with kind of story and, being able to kind of fashion the nuances. And I don't know, I don't think I'll ever abandon the kind of sound element. And, the reason why I get on so well, one of the many reasons I get on so well with Denis is his dedication to sound as well. I think there's just a method by which we work that ensures that the sound is going to be a thrilling partner in this. It doesn't end up being done by me. We create a roadmap, me and Denis, and I spend, a ridiculous amount of time on it. But ultimately, we throw everything away and hand it to the likes of Richard King, who's a brilliant sound editor, sound supervisor, and he'll fashion his own recordings and, do his very elaborate work to try and kind of, design the ultimate Harkonnen harvester, for example, or, what is the sound of a baby worm having its bile removed. He's the expert.
But Joe, when you're sort of creating that roadmap, you must be taking time to find sounds that sort of indicate a direction, right? You and Denis must be doing that, the two of you, a little bit. Obviously, there's like a whole process that must happen afterwards, but what's that like for you? Are you coming up with notions and suggesting them to Denis and showing them? Or?
Yeah. Well, sometimes it's just my kind of path into cutting a scene is a sound route, it's a sound path. And it's interesting, we're not talking about music. I think, out of respect for music, I think we're very kind to composers because we don't put music in too early. We don't allow the music into the process. We're trying to kind of make the film stand on its own 2 feet before we're inviting a composer to come in and do their part. And it liberates them sometimes not to do all the heavy lifting. Sometimes a musical thing can be conveyed by a sound effect. We all kind of basically are in each other's lanes. Hans often makes music that's on the verge of being sound design. There's often sound design that's on, that could be played by a band. And I'm in the middle of all of that. So I'll give you an example. So in Dune Part 1, one of the opening scenes is a breakfast scene where Paul Atreides, and the purpose of the scene is to explain what the Bene Gesserit are and what a Bene Gesserit training involves. And it's all about using the voice. It sets up the voice, which you then get to meet Charlotte Rampling's character use with devastating effect. She can push somebody all the way across the room with it. But we felt, it was part of the writing process that they needed to kind of set this idea up. And to have this kind of slightly pushy dance mum feeling about Jessica, that it's an introduction. It's a teenager who's reluctant to be there, it's very relatable. But Denis had shot he'd shot the scene as a scene between Rebecca and Timothée, and he'd given me all the beautiful options of different shot sizes. And that's kind of a big part of, what a film editor does is work out when do you want to be on the close-up, when are you going to use the establishing shot. It doesn't have to be at the beginning. Could sometimes be a way of expressing the isolation of a character to cut wide if you look at the worm ride, I'm using the wide shots really late into the sequence to say the poor little vulnerable kid on the side of a dune, right? But here you're doing that job. You're kind of selecting the performances that work, you think, the best, the vocal performances, visual performances, everything that these great actors give you. It's an abundance of great stuff. And all the, keeping an eye on the nuances of what Greg Fraser supplies, the director of photography, and also the kind of use of what Denny is doing and sort of mind reading what they're doing on set the day before. I'm always working a day after them. But then he'd also shot these kind of shots that were loose. They were kind of B-roll. He knew that they could be there or they could maybe be somewhere later in the film, but it felt like there are story points that we could allude to that don't necessarily need to be a scene, but they need to be the kind of world-building material that I might need, which is that the Atreides' grandfather was killed in a bullfight. So there's this little bull that needs to be established. And it says something quite deep, I think, about the kind of family they are. As a British person whose parents were World War II vintage, I kind of understood that sort of, it's a mixture of bravery and something slightly psychotic, right? To face down a bull. It's a little bit insane. And so it is with the Atreides, this idea of setting up their kind of noble purpose to go onto an oven and fight certain death was kind of what that bull, I think, is what Frank Herbert is saying. Anyway, but he shot that. So I thought, well, I can use that as a way of saying Paul is entering this sort of hypnotic state and that he's able to kind of, permeate the room in some way with a kind of some ineffable thing that he has to tap into that gives him, it's not like a magic power. It's not a Harry Potter thing. There's going to be no purple light effect. It's just going to be a little shift and a control of his voice and the commanding nature of finding a commanding nature. And I could use the sound effect. Actually, the real key to that scene was this sort of sound of a chandelier. And I just had some tinkling sound that I used it to cut against. And without it, I think I wouldn't have found the kind of rhythm of it. I'm just trying to find a musical way of doing it, and it felt right because you weren't taken out of the room. There wasn't a magic flash noise. I didn't need even any music to tell that story. I just needed to say that something has shifted in the room. And then it gave me the opportunity to do these little time loops in how she moves he says, give me the water, and she starts moving it, but stops herself before. And then you can cut and show that she hasn't moved. It was just you were in her head imagining herself moving it. It's kind of like a subtle little thing that you could do that it's kind of musical and it's edity and it's, it's them and it's me, it's Denny. It's like but without the kind of sound. That was my kind of way into that thing of thinking, well, I'll use those shots right now. There's a chandelier shot, there's a shot of the bull, there's a shot of the grandfather. There's material that I can use here to sort of go into another realm, which is the gift of film editing, right? I mean, that's what we can do.
Give me the water. Our enemies are all around us, and in so many futures they prevail. But I do see a way. There is a narrow way through.
I remember reading a quote from Denis saying, "This is such a beloved book. If we don't strike the appropriate balance, this is something that could take us down." And I want to ask, even in describing this one scene that I, of course, appreciated, but obviously did not appreciate the complexity that you're describing, were there ever moments where you become overwhelmed by it, or is it just taking one step, approaching it like Paul Atreides, where you're just taking one step at a time and on your journey?
Yeah, I think Denny's right to be apprehensive. It proved to be a difficult film to adapt in the past, and it's a kind of monolithic book. I mean, I'm always ragging him about just what did he try and bite off? I mean, it's so fractal a piece of writing. The world building is extreme, and the requirement of him as a director is extreme, because but he's pulled it off. I mean, that's the truth. Is that world building? There's an answer behind everything. He would be at his least comfortable in my cutting room if I was pointing at him something, saying, "Well, I don't explain that to me," and if he didn't have an answer. And yet he does, and it's kind of figured out. It's conceptually worked out, and many of the things, he has to figure out how do you climb on a worm, how do you ride a worm, how do you physical things. How does a harvester work? What's it like underneath a harvester? There's so much detail there's plenty in the book, but it's often left. There's big gaps in the storytelling, right? I mean, it doesn't necessarily tell you how to extract the bile from a baby worm. And he has to kind of figure that out. But that's kind of part of the joy of working with Denny. Is I think he's at that level where his world building is so strong, and it's just such a delicious conversation to find out about it, right? I mean, the path into working on his films is adorned with these trees. You get the script, and then you get the storyboards, which are stunning.
And I presume everything is so intricately storyboarded.
Well, he won't necessarily storyboard a two-hander. If there's a conversation between two people, then there's no need. There might be a setup shot, but it's the you have storyboards, and you have now previs, quite advanced previs, and they will tend to be things that are more to do with the worm, or some CGI element, right? So, for example, you wouldn't necessarily get a fight sequence. You wouldn't get the whole fight as part of the storyboard, but you would get the kind of star frames. They have a law really on set, which is that there's the script, and then there's the storyboard, and then there's nature. And I think nature includes the actors in some way.
Mm-hmm.
That they'll always be, I'm always impressed at how they'll do all this preparation, yet tear it all up at a minute's notice when something better comes along. And I think Denny tries to preserve, in the middle of all that preparation, which you can imagine must be quite a heavy burden to carry. There's these scenes where it's made up. It's free. There's some moments between Paul and Chani in the desert when they're getting together, and it's like got a lovely ad-libbed, beautiful magic hour, grabbed kind of feeling. Go and walk over there. Yep, got it. Yep, let's come around. It's not a sort of all divided up. It's just that if you're going to shoot the worm sequence, the worm ride sequence, then that's mapped out to a great degree. It has to be. Greg has to know that the shadow is going to be there on that dune at this time, that we then do this shot so that the shadow is there. Otherwise, we'll still be filming it.
The sequences that are in the desert, are they all shot between certain hours? I mean, the light is so magical for the majority of those shots. Do those have to be shot at magic hour, or is that post effects?
Oh, no, it's all real. Dune Part 1 was like really at a different time of year, and they were only able to film in very few hours. It's early in the morning, daybreak and dusk. And at any other time, their brains would have fried in their brains, in their skulls. It's unimaginable heat. But Dune Part 1 was quite a different thing. There was less desert footage. And it was, I can remember from the dailies, I wasn't there in the desert. I was just receiving the dailies. And it was very kind of, you hear Denny's voice a lot saying, okay, go back there, yep, and now go in. And it's a little bit more like, just keep running. It's all, we've only got minutes. You can feel the clock counting down. Whereas in part two, it was much more desert footage because we're in the Fremen world far more. And I would say, well, put it this way, it was very hard in the cutting room to suggest dropping a shot because sometimes they'd built a road, to get to that shot. It's very different. There was a much more infrastructure and it was much more, multiple locations and just an extraordinary amount of kind of preparation by Denny, Greg, the producers, Tanya Lapointe, and everybody connecting to try and make things happen over a big geographic space.
As I was watching it last night, Joe, I realized the tremendous amount of sort of velocity to the actual narrative that was required to take place in part two. Part one felt like we were more setting the scenes and introducing characters. And part two, it felt like we were watching Paul sort of race through this sort of journey of like becoming a man and potential Messiah. Was that always the plan narratively to like sort of speed through that, sort of act two, not speed through, but it felt like we were really on a pace. Tell me a little bit about that.
I suppose that's where most of our kind of effort, the way that it works normally with an editor is you work, a day after the shoot, wherever that may be. And so for a long period of time, maybe 18, 19 weeks, you're working in tandem with the units, various units, the main unit that's filming the principal actors, and then all the other units. We had on this one a worm unit that was shooting pretty constantly, and we had a fetus unit, which was like creating all this incredible footage inside Jessica. And we had aerial units and stunt units and VFX units and everything else. So you have all this material coming in, and I'm trying to kind of keep up with it day in, day out. And then at the end, I go off and make a little cut, and then Denny has a couple of days off, and then he comes, sits in this very sofa behind me. But in that 10 weeks, to answer your question, it's all about trying to kind of make sure that the tug on the rope is firm, right? And that it takes a lot of kind of failure to get that right. It's partly because I think Denny has, the reason why you feel like that is that Denny does have a great command over suspense out of many directors. He understands. If you look at the worm ride, most of the worm ride, there's no worm. It's about the worm ride about to happen. So it's a slow build, but you're always clear what you're building to. It's not just random tension music or anything. In fact, there's no music at all. It's just footsteps, breaths, a thumper, a heartbeat to a thing, a sense of trepidation. And that there's different points. He manages different points of view very carefully with Greg. So it's finding an expression of that in the cut. And then when it happens, it's like I'm really holding back. And he's holding back as a director. He'll put things into a big wide shot and play things in one. So that when you finally see the worm coming towards you, you're not like slamming in and saying, there's a worm. You're going, oh shit, I am Paul. And this fucking thing is going to bite my head off. It's like he's very, very good at planting the audience in his sequences, right?
But as are you. I mean, it's one of the more brilliant scenes in that the anticipation is really realized on Chani's face. And I forgot the Javier Bardem's character's name. Stilgar. But that is how we're feeling through them because we can't even see Paul's face. I mean, he's covered up completely, and it's so brilliant. It's so masterfully done. It is one of the great all-time scenes. I can't imagine how long it took for you guys.
Once he lands on the worm, that element of it took 44 days and was not shot in the desert. It's kind of interesting.
What? Say more. 44 days?
Yeah, so that's where the worm unit comes in.
Okay, tell me a little bit more about the worm unit.
So the worm unit is like from the moment where he jumps from the dune So Paul is running up the dune. That's all shot in the desert with a CGI element of the worm. And the dune he's on is like water, like a waterfall. And this worm is coursing through, and he realizes he has to kind of just collapse onto the worm and try and get a grip. And Denny had devised this idea of the way you get on is with these grappling hooks that you lift up the skin of the worm, and in some way the worm doesn't like it and has to stay above ground. Otherwise, it would just take you down. But what Denny was always trying to say to me is he's riding on something the size of a skyscraper. It's not a little worm, it's a giant worm. And some of the things he would tell me, of course, you respond to as an editor, but also kind of in sound terms. I did put right from the outset, I got the storyboards for that, and I started laying sound to it. It was my way. I don't think I even showed it to Denny. In fact, I'm certain I didn't show it to Denny. It was just like I got the storyboards, and I had a month before we were starting, and I thought, damn it, let's just find out what this feels like. I have the sound of a thumper, I have the sound of I got my libraries full of things like grinding metal and girders. So I was kind of, and in fact, it reminded me a bit like I was born in the 60s, right? So television was often like two cameras in the back of a studio and somebody turning the pages of a book, right? That was family entertainment when I was 6, on one of the 2 available channels. So it felt a little bit like that, really naive, really naive. I would pan across, but that way I kind of understand, at some point there's a practical reason for that, which is VFX need to know how long a shot is going to be. And if you add a second to a shot, if you add 8 frames to a shot when they're in that final 20% of developing the shot, it's a huge amount of money. And more often the problem isn't money, it's time. They haven't got time to do it because these things involve giant simulations and, villages of computer. So anyway, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but
no, it's like the juice I love. This is the stuff that everyone wants to know, like getting inside your brain and getting into these these scenes. It's incredible. To sort of pivot to a couple of other scenes, because I really love to hear about like the specifics of this, because I think it really does get to the heart of your process. Talk to me about the infrared scene when Fade is trying to prove himself on Geidi Prime.
You're close. Look, I'm not going to be a snob. It was like Geidi Prime is
Geidi Prime. I want to get it right.
We had to, one of the first things we had to do is like listen to audiobooks and decide how to pronounce things. Are pronounced. And I think actually, so always the Bible was that if Frank Herbert said Geidi Prime, then Geidi Prime is how it was. But Charney, there's about 3 different versions. Some people say Cheney, some people say Charney. And it's like, after a while, things take a life of their own. I think actually Fade Ralpha came from Charlotte Rampling. It was like, that was the very first piece of filming, was her talking about Fade being a psychopath. And when she said Fade Ralpha, we all obey. It's like, okay, that's the way that we're going to. It's not Rotha, it's Ralpha. And I just imagine Charlotte. So quite a lot of the time you're trying to decide these. God damn it, Frank Herbert makes it difficult. There's, he's Paul Atreides, he's the Mahdi, he's Muad'Dib, he's the Kwisatz Haderach. That takes a while to kind of perfect.
Oh, geez,
he's the path, the way, the light. It's a biblical kind of proliferation of names. Is what I mean by fractal. It's not particularly cinematic as a piece of writing. In fact, cinematic is not knowing anybody's name. If you think about some of the most famous films, I can remember, for example, I know that Marilyn Monroe in Some Like It Hot is called Sugar. That just sticks in your memory, and they say it a lot in the film. but I can't remember what Tony Curtis's name is. Can you?
No.
It's like if you read a script and you were working on it, you'd be aware of it because it would be on the page. But, names are not a particularly cinematic thing. It's kind of verbal. It's a theatrical. It's not a cinematic thing. I don't know who the I is in Withnail and I, but I certainly know what the character is like.
So, Joe, were you dealing with that a lot in the edit? Were the actual characters within the film getting pronunciation wrong? Was there like a lot of handling of ADR?
Yeah, I had to bring, a giant magnet to all of the performances to just make sure that they always said Fade Routher and not Fade Rother. Maybe I'm even getting it wrong now. It's been a little while since I had to kind of apply the magnet, But what I wanted to say about Fade Routher is what's really interesting, and it connects the two last things we were talking about, which is one of the things that we adapted in that 10 weeks that I worked with Denny. The plan was slightly to intercut them more, and there's a very good reason, which is in a kind of way Fade Routher has to be a sort of shadow to Paul. And when you think about it, there's, while Paul has his Lady Jessica manipulating events and trying to develop him into this mythical character against the teachings and advice of her sisterhood. Paul Atreides, when we meet him, is not the one. He's several generations in advance of the one. Their plan is somewhere down the line. So, pushy Jessica decides out of vanity to have a son, not a daughter. And so you meet a young man who's who in some way his fate has been decided for him by his mother. And similarly, Fade Routher is the nephew of Harkonnen, Baron Harkonnen. And Baron Harkonnen, Stellan Skarsgård's character, has machinations for him, which has to turn Fade from a psychopath and a playboy into a potential emperor. And with Paul, in part 2, we had to go from a little desert rat who's been abandoned, could easily be converted into water by the Fremen. He's got no weapon. He's got no means of survival in the desert. He's in the company of an increasingly psychotic mother figure and a slightly indifferent tribe. And he's got to go from that to standing on a worm and being a messianic figure. And so we have to go from both characters sort of shadow each other. Of course, we spent the perspective of the film is far more Paul's and then eventually Charlie's, I would say, at the end. But the idea to finesse that in the cutting room was to do with scene order. It was to do with kind of, I have a lot of marble is delivered to the cutting room, and then we got to make the perfect sculpture. So by shedding and finessing and placing, you could really shape that journey. We ended up deciding we need to go all the way. So apart from a few little peregrinations to the Harkonnens to explain how they're reacting and how they're in a way on the back foot, with Raban being insanely kind of motivated by anger and rage. And it means that we're ready for Fade in the story, but it means you get to pull that rope for longer on Paul. That was one of the things that we did. And then when you cut to Fade, you meet this guy. You're setting up the idea that his callousness knows no end. He can just slice a girl's neck and not even think about it. And there's something truly horrific about the way that he dispatches these people around him. As an introduction, it's terrifying, I think. And seeing their culture, that somebody's purpose in life is to be some meat that he gets to test his weapon on. It's kind of very, very dark introduction to him.
Did you find that you were, when you say sculpt, were you losing a lot of material or pushing material over one character over another? Like, I was just curious, like, did you lose any scenes in the process of trying to sculpt? Were the things that were left little, darlings?
Oh yeah, I'm sure we did. But even in one scene, we can, it's good. I have the main writer sitting on my sofa. So it's kind of, the edit is a final draft. And it meant that we could, like, sometimes we fight over just like one word, very nice. He's Canadian, I'm British, and we're both incredibly polite. And when we really kind of are in dispute, there's a little kumquat tree outside, and we go and just like escape the room for 5 minutes and go and eat a kumquat. It's kind of very sweet.
Like any good relationship. That's so amazing.
And there's a limit to how many kumquats. There's only so many. The poor tree would be dead if we were getting on well. We did get on really well. I must say, I kind of felt right from the outset that was somebody whose sensibility. I mean, he once said to me halfway through Sicario, he said in this very beautifully Canadian way, he said, I don't want to offend you, but I think we have the same sensibility.
The new Boost Mobile network is offering unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month for life.
That sounds like a threat.
Then how do you think we should say it?
Unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month for the rest of your life?
I don't know.
Until your ultimate demise.
What if we just say forever?
Okay.
$25 a month, forever.
Get unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month with Boost Mobile forever.
After 30 gigabytes, customers may experience slower speeds. Customers will pay $25 a month as long as they remain active on the Boost Unlimited plan.
You wouldn't be the first relative I've killed. May thy knife chip and shatter. May thy knife chip and shatter.
Well, it's so funny, Joe. I interviewed Kevin Tent, and he obviously has like a long-term marriage with Alexander Payne in much the same way that you have with Denis. And I loved talking to Kevin about the relationship and the dynamic, because there are very few people, I'm sure, in your life that you have a relationship like this. It's like, that as long-standing and as constant and intense. You've been with Denis over all these films, and the scope of the work has just become more ambitious and bigger. And I'm just curious about your observation over the years and years you've been working on. I don't know how many films it is at this point, but it feels like
I think it's
6 or 7.
We're getting together next year for the 6th, I think. I did Sicario, Arrival, Blade Runner 2049, Dune 1, Dune 2, and then we're doing Dune Messianic. So coming up to our 6th. Look, I think the really smart thing about Denis is that he didn't bite off more than he could chew. I'm really glad that that I grew and he grew, and everybody, he was offered a huge film very early on after Prisoners. I think he was offered a massive film. It was a huge established franchise at Paramount. There's the clue. And he turned it down, right? Because he felt he wasn't ready for it. And it would have, he would have lost something. He would have been I know that the studio loved him and loved what he did with Arrival. So it's it might have worked very, very well, but it's like he might have lost some of his own authentic voice in doing that. And I think, if you look at it in terms of VFX, for example, Sicario had a couple of hundred shots. They were mostly the vehicles going through Juarez, very little, or Roger Deakins shooting that one. So it was all, it was things like there's this amazing kind of sequence on the bridge of America, and that's had set extension. So it was that kind of work. It wasn't, you could watch the film in my cutting room and you wouldn't be missing anything, really, any story beat. Even the kind of, my assistant Javier at the time, he sort of drew little cars going over the bridge. But you're going through to something that's got over 2,000 shots and where major story elements are missing. And halfway in that process was Arrival, where, it was kind of a big, wonderful learning experience to kind of have two characters, Abbott and Costello, as they were called, who aren't there. They're just somebody in a green lycra suit holding a tennis ball, for the longest time.
Where are you in the stages of Dune Messiah? Where are you at the moment?
I'm awaiting. I'm getting calls. I've been signed up. I'm getting calls. There's a script that's, I don't know, I know that it's on its way. I'm never pushing for it. I see Denny all the time, but we don't necessarily, we're friends, so we just talk about how's the family, and we'll have a bit of a gossip and move on. But I don't press him because I know when it's ready, it's ready, and it's kind of really good to know that he's presenting me something it's not really such a work in progress, and then it means that I'm reading something. But yeah, I mean, I'm talking to teams and working out who to hire in my team, and I'm just kind of bracing myself. Doing those films as an editor is a little bit of a marathon. It certainly is for him, but for me, I'm on it for a year or 14 months, and I've kind of learnt the rhythm of it, but the commitment to it now is that you have to be healthy, you have to be well, you have to be mentally well. You can't go into those things stressed. You have to kind of keep up. I have the most amazing team around me whose careers I'm damaging enormously by keeping them close to me and not letting them leave and go and do the next step in their career. I mean, they're all basically at the top of their game, and it's a long process in which you're going to do a lot of 6 or 7 day weeks and many hours, and what we do really takes time. So I love working at home. I get up sometimes at 5 and I just cut in my pajamas until I'm aware that somebody's going to come around, and I don't give up until 11 or 12 at night. I'll go and have a glass of whiskey and watch an episode of some reality show to calm down, and then I'm back at it, and I'm never complaining because it's what I love to do.
Joe, it's like so incredible to be truly obsessed with your professional work. I mean, I think it's like one of the things, the hallmarks of the people I talk to, that they truly, I mean, it's torturous otherwise, right? Because it is such a demanding thing that we do. Do you find that you guys have just found your squad and that is part of the process?
Yeah, but I'm humble about this because I don't take for granted that I'm going to get the call to be on Denny's next film ever. I know that it would be a tough decision for anybody to make, but maybe I'm not the right person for that particular job. I
love that. After you've won the Oscar for Dune, that you might not be the person. I think that's incredible to stay humble, Joe.
Oh, isn't that the thing? Otherwise, we become these preposterous Hollywood self-congratulatory figures, and that we're unable to embrace the opportunities we do have and the ability to, it's kind of, and also there are long periods in between his films, and I kind of, what I do in the time in between, I always see that as an opportunity to learn, something new and bring something new to the table. There are a whole load of tools that are available that I can try out on other things. It's a bit like everybody in the industry does that. I was always impressed. I worked with a lovely, just a wonderful filmmaker in Britain, Kevin MacDonald.
Yeah, of course.
Who made, really, I think, one of the best documentaries about the, One Day in September is the first film of his I saw, and I just flabbergasted by that film. But he will use, adverts as a way of trying different tools, different, lenses, different approaches, and to become expert in it. And each of these films has their own technical bar is always being raised, especially, Greg Fraser. He's a real Tigger, in terms of, he's kind of, I would say, an amazing technical achiever, and he'll bring along, on this one, we worked in IMAX native formats. We used A6 5 cameras, which gives you, a huge image to work from to address all of the kind of issues of framing, the infrared. And, it's like there's a lot of stuff to learn in editing as well. Of course, AI is coming in, and that's becoming a sort of tool that you have to kind of get. Somebody's put it very well, and they said AI isn't going to steal your job, but somebody who's really good with AI is going to steal your job. It's like our industry every 30 years goes through some, with almost clockwork precision.
Yes.
There's some massive upgrade, and we're right in the middle of one at the moment, which you can either, when I was an assistant in the early 90s and digital came along, I saw a lot of really beloved editors just fall by the wayside because they just didn't want to go that extra round and learn some new way of doing it, and they retired. They moved away, and a younger generation came over. We're sort of in that mode right now. I think it's that 30 years later thing.
So, Joe, can you tell me how? Because I am fascinated by AI, and I think you're right. The only way to sort of continue is to figure out how to incorporate, because it's here, incorporate it artfully into what we do. How have you done that yourself? Like, have you learned any tools? Can you just tell me, what's your approach?
Well, one of the big tools that you can use is the kind of way of cleaning up audio, for example. That's the one that's the go-to. I'm working on films where often there's fans and the sound isn't right, and sometimes in second unit, there's no sound at all, so there's nothing. So they don't bother with sound recorders because they'd only be recording, somebody shouting instructions on a megaphone, and there's no dialogue to be kept or anything like that. So, it's a kind of an audio tool as much as that's the thing I'm using most of all. And I know that it's a commonplace now for people to use sort of placeholder shots. For example, sometimes I'm getting really into the weeds here, but it's like sometimes you need to create a new background plate. And what you do is you take a shot that somebody's in and then you remove them. And using, Photoshop and things like that, you're able to use generative fill and you can generate new plates. They're all temporary, but they're a way of, I've got to put this film in front of a studio, ourselves, a studio and a test audience before all the VFX are made. So I have to show something that people aren't going to laugh at how poor it looks. And they're going to, they'll be told that this will be state of art when it's done, but actually it's a necessary thing to tell the story fully. And to do that, we're using every digital tool available to us to try and sell it to an audience.
What's your opinion on the films that don't have the budget of DUNE, using those as the final shots? Like, do you feel, I don't know how to feel about it yet, and so it's more of like an exploratory question.
Yeah.
Because they are money savers, right, ultimately, but they are taking the jobs of other people who are working very hard to make great art.
Well, yeah, the sound tool is a particularly perilous one because, for example, you can take 20 seconds of a person's performance and replicate their voice completely. And I've used it for myself, and I used it I did a freebie documentary this year, and used it as a kind of placeholder before I then went back to the person, asked them to, I wrote a narration, and instead of putting text on the screen, I used an AI voice. The truth about it is, in this kind of scenario, it's very different. Denny is never going to go for that because he's very protective of his actors. And I think it's fair to say that AI at the moment is only good at replicating what's happened in the past. It's, you can replicate, let's take an example. I could replicate Javier Bardem's voice, but I'll never be able to replicate the choices that Javier Bardem is going to make. And those are just unbelievable nuggets of gold that come my way as an editor. Just a simple thing like he does duck calls. who knows that his duck calls, they're so specific and so characterful.
Brilliant.
They're brilliant, right? But they come from Javier Bardem's childhood or something that he's channeled and brought to the table. Anyway, to return to AI, it's just the fact is, of course, we can replicate what's been the choices of the past. And I think it'll date, right? Lots of those shots where it's being used, they date because in some way it's rotten carrion, at the heart of it. I'm not negating its potential as a research tool and as an inspirational tool or as a writing partner, which I think is brilliant. But let's not forget, it's the human mind that is capable of breaking the barrier.
In closing, because we have to lose you, I could talk to you for hours and I might have to invite you back. Why do you think these films have had such an impact and have worked as well as they can? And part of it is just you guys have such holistic vision and think about things that you don't even realize as a viewer. But do you have any opinions on that?
Look, I think on some fundamental level, it's of its time in terms of talking about the politics of the world and in terms of, oil and religion. It's the frame that we're in, at the moment. It's kind of quite a curious thing that I've learned as an editor, which is that the length of a film is, pace isn't about minutes and seconds, it's about engagement. And when do you feel you're, if the object of this thing is to kind of create an epic film where you come to the end and you could take some more, you could easily take some more. And that's the essential.
This was such a pleasure, Joe. It was so lovely to get to meet you, and you are really one of the greatest working editors, and I can't thank you enough for doing this. And Matthew, thank you for setting this up. And so we will speak again, Joe, but go continue to do your brilliant work. We're lucky to have you in this business.
Thank you. From you, it means a lot. I appreciate it. Yeah, fantastic.
Lead them to paradise.
Vanessa, I love Joe Walker so much. I hope we can work with him one day. He's clearly just such a genius, and I love the way he thinks about not only the visual, but sound and music. We didn't even get to talk about Hans Zimmer and how he interacts with the composer, but the movies that he edits are such world creations, and clearly sound is such a huge component to that, and I loved hearing him talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were talking about this offline, but it's just such a big movie. It's such a big franchise. It's so hard to know how to kind of go into these conversations. He's just so impressive and he's handling so much. It was so fascinating to listen to that. I feel like I could have listened to 3 more hours of him talking about.
We could have just done an entire episode on The Worm and the 44-day shoot that was required for the Worm ride. And so
having a whole separate crew or team just for The Worm is
just for The Worm.
Unbelievable.
I watched the movie again last night and Ted was like, "Oh, I'll just watch football." And then he came in, and it's a film. It's only my second time watching it, but it's so incredibly intricate. It is watching a masterclass in filmmaking, and because it is so much intimate character work, but it is also one of the great sci-fi films with incredible action sequences. And so it really is tipping a hat to Joe and also Denis Villeneuve. Just watching him like progress as a filmmaker is just a joy. It's a joy to see him. I can't wait for Dune Messiah whenever that gets going. But it's just like I expect the best from Denis Villeneuve, and I've never been disappointed.
Oh, it's insane. And I do think one of my favorite things about Denis movies in general is really the pacing and how kind of the tension builds. These movies just feel so lived in. And I I tip my hat to Joe, because I think clearly that is comes so much from him, and he has had so much experience with Denis working on Arrival, and he worked with him on Blade Runner, and he edited 12 Years a Slave for the listeners that don't know. So he's just so good at these tension building dramas and making, I think, a movie that's meant to be this, big studio fare feel really, really dramatic. And it's such beautiful work.
And I think that's why his movies work so well, is because they actually do feel like character pieces.
Yeah.
And I think that's why any actor he asks probably is happy to sign up for months and months in the desert, because they know that it's not just, a two-dimensional character that's being put into a huge sci-fi film. It's really like there are character arcs, there's performance, and he cares about that kind of thing. And so it's kind of amazing.
Yeah.
So thank you, Joe Walker. You are a genius. I hope you'll come back. That was so fun.
I know we need to do more of his movies. Just looking at the list, it's crazy.
No, it's incredible. There's just certain people we've interviewed where it's like they never make a wrong choice and they don't do, any work that they would be embarrassed by. And he's obviously just one of them. So that was amazing.
Amazing.
All right, my friend, let's wrap it up. That was another great one.
That was a great episode. Like and subscribe to Hollywood Gold Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on Instagram at Hollywood Gold Pod. We have some really great clips of previous shows. If you haven't seen or listened to some of the episodes, you can dig in there and pick some of your favorites. Go on staygoldfeatures.com and hit the merch tab to buy yourself some merch. And stay gold, everyone.
Stay gold, guys.